Good afternoon, and welcome to Serving Homeless Youth and Families. I'm going to talk just briefly today about our homeless youth. I had the privilege of working in a town of 15,000, school district of 15,000, as the homeless and foster liaison. And this work became near and dear to me, and the challenges of homeless youth and their families became so apparent and evident in everything that we did and how we can support them in different ways. As we start looking at homeless youth, what do you think of when you first hear the word homeless? Many times we only think of kids living on the street or people living on the street and they don't have anywhere to go. The McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act came in, actually was updated in 2016, and it helps us to get a better grasp on what homeless actually is according to the schools. The very basic part of that is that children lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Fixed, adequate, um, and I think those are the two. Regular, we get regular. Is it someplace that they're going to be able to stay long term? Is it someplace they don't worry about getting kicked out the next day? Adequate becomes a huge issue. We have families in our school district, and of our 15,000 kids, 90% are low socioeconomic status. So we had over 1,000 kids who were qualified as homeless students in that district. One of the things that we found is that many times we were missing children in the sense of being able to support them and help them because they had not been identified as being homeless because, as you see in the first bullet, they were sharing housing with someone else because they'd lost theirs, they'd been evicted, there wasn't enough income to pay the bills, divorce, medical issues. We can go on and on about why someone would lose their housing and have to move in with someone else. What we found was many families then determined, because of economic hardship, to move in together. Sometimes that meant three families sharing a three-bedroom house, and each family had one bedroom. That is not adequate in the sense of the children could not possibly have beds to sleep on if five or six people are sharing one room. And it took our due diligence to talk with families and find out about this. What we found, and one of the things I would encourage you to look for is when families come in and they have a bill. Many times the schools don't ask anything else. You've got a bill, a utility, maybe it's the water bill that shows your name at that address. The next person may come in and they show the electric bill, but the electric bill's at that same address. And what we began to see is families were choosing one utility to pay for, or they divided it up so that the schools wouldn't question them, their living circumstance. They still needed assistance many times because maybe two of the three families did not have an income coming in that helped support that family in any other way. Homeless also means that they're living in motels or hotels or trailer parks or campgrounds. Now, there's a caveat there because we do have families who lived in trailer parks because their home literally was a larger motor home that they chose to live there. Um, of their own accord. It wasn't something that they had to do. And so, in that sense, they were not homeless. They were choosing to be living in that motorhome because many of those might have been migrant workers. They were moving from place to place, and it gave them a stable place to stay. So we go back to fixed and regular and adequate, meaning there were beds in there for the children to sleep on. There were utilities, so they would have not been counted as our homeless kids. We do have so many, though, in the community where I was the homeless liaison who lived in motels. Almost 20% of my homeless families at one time lived in motels, and I had several families that had been in a motel for more than a year. Those families could not get other housing Sometimes because of criminal record, previous evictions kept them from public housing. There were a number of factors that came into play. They would move in, they had water, electricity, um, but they were struggling and they did not have their own home. And they could be evicted at any time, even from the hotels. Living in emergency and transitional shelters is another huge issue. There are very few family shelters in our country. We have women's shelters and men's shelters, but family shelters are a challenge. We had only 2 or 3, if you counted the transitional housing in our community. We had a family abuse center, which was a shelter for those families, those parents, those teenagers, whomever who had been abused. But the men's and women's shelters were open and available. The women could bring a child with them, but it was not really a safe place for kids to be. The family shelters, on the other side, many times will not accept teenagers, and particularly male teenagers. And it was for them, and then what their statements were. It was a part of their laws. It was a part of the rules and regulations. It was a safety issue. But they would not accept teens many times. So it put many families in a challenge to find a place to stay overnight. Living in public or private places that you wouldn't normally sleep. We had one father come in and say that they had been kicked out of the hospital. And I said, help me understand. And he said, well, he realized when one of the children were in the hospital, they would let the parents sleep in the lobby thinking they had someone upstairs. And at that time, he did have someone upstairs. He and the older child slept in the lobby many nights, even after the younger child was dismissed, who'd gone to live with an aunt. So we have all kinds of situations that go on with our families. Migratory children who live in any of the above situations can be categorized as McKinney-Vento homeless in our schools. One of the most challenging factors that I find is our unaccompanied youth who are living in those situations. Our unaccompanied youth our unaccompanied youth are those children who have either been kicked out of the home or they've run away from home, and they are literally living on their own without a parent overseeing them in any way or a guardian. McKinney-Vento mandates that we do several things, and one of those is immediate enrollment. We put kids in school. We talk about schools. We must enroll them without even knowing their circumstance. I have come across many schools in my work of the last 40 years in education who required families to show proof of residence before they would enroll children. That's not legal. Kids need to be enrolled. You have a month in to filter through and get down to the truth or find out the circumstances. But every child needs to be enrolled in school immediately. And then we find out later what those situations are around that child's existence in those homes or wherever they're living. Choice of schools is written in the law, but it has some caveats to it that we need to identify. One of those is you can't just come in and pick a school in any district. We will encourage families to go to the school in their area, the neighborhood school, so that even if they're living doubled up or they're in a shelter, they're in a school where the neighborhood children who they attend school with are also in the neighborhood, and they can associate with those on any time they choose. Choice of schools happens if you come into the school and you choose for your child to go to one school, then you need to be able to provide transportation for that child to get there. And it's also on availability. If class sizes are not full and the school is not over capacity at that time. Transportation is always provided for our homeless children. That way, when they move, if they're moving from house to house, they may be with one family for a couple of months and then the aunt kicks them out and they go to grandma's house and back and forth. then at that time, I could set up a bus to come by and pick them up wherever they were living and take them back to what's called the school of origin. That way, that one stable thing that that child had in their life was being able to attend that same school throughout the year. If their situation did not change and they were still homeless and they were still bouncing around, they still could remain at that school the next year. It held true as well for feeder patterns. For instance, if I was fourth and fifth grade at one elementary school, and my next year I was still in that homeless situation, but living in a different area, I could choose to go back to my feeder pattern middle school or high school as well. Services are also required to be provided for those students. They have many educational needs, supplies needs, clothing needs. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. And it's also mandated in the law that the homeless liaison in the district helps them with any dispute resolutions or dispute and resolution to whatever they feel like they have been unjustly given, news that they don't agree with, a placement that they don't agree with. And we've had a few of those that we've handled as well. In the United States, this is statistics back from Texas Homeless Education Office in 2017. There were over 2.5 million children who were homeless in the U.S. It represents about 1 out of every 30 kids. Texas alone had at this time, over 115,000 children. In Texas, 16,000 of those youth, or more than that now, experienced homelessness on their own or were those unaccompanied youth that I mentioned earlier. Unaccompanied youth are not in the physical custody of a parent. As we think about our families and we think about the situations, we think about the shelters. A homeless youth could go to a men's or women's shelter. But on any given day, even with our families, they are in the evenings, so 4 to 5 in the evenings, and they have to be out by 8 the next morning, rain or shine. So a mother who has a young child who is living in a shelter of any kind must leave during the day, find some place to stay before they can return back to the shelters in the evenings. With our unaccompanied youth, 20 to 40% state that they have been abused sexually in their homes. One of the main reasons that they leave. Sorry. There we go. 40 to 60% say they were abused physically. More than 65% reported at least one parent who abused drugs or alcohol. It's a huge issue of the children that I worked with who would flee at times because of the physical abuse or the sexual abuse that occurred when a parent was either high or was drunk, and it was just a very volatile situation many, many times. 20 to 40% say they were thrown out because of sexual orientation or pregnancy. Many of our high school students that we worked with, that was the cause. I only had 4 students over the last 2.5 years who were pregnant who were thrown out of the house. But I had about 10 or 12 who literally were thrown out because of they had come out to tell the parent that their sexual orientation was different from what mom or dad had expected it to be. And there was a conflict there with that, and they decided that the child could no longer stay in their home. So what do our homeless students need to be successful? Whether we look at our unaccompanied youth or the majority of our kids who are doubled up, more than 65% of our students were living with someone else. And so what do they need to be successful? One of the things that I found was that so many times the parents did not truly understand the resources that were available to them. Now, I'll be honest, we had families that knew all the resources. They knew how to basically work the system. They knew every possible way in which they could get monies or support or food or everything else. But what I honestly found was probably 70% of my families were very, very proud, and they did not want to reach out and ask for assistance. We many times had to really try to pry almost to get them to open up to us, to build a relationship first with them, to get them to share with us what's happening in their lives and how we can help with them. One of the things that we began to do with our homeless students once they were identified was to do a resource analysis of the family. We needed to see what resources were available to them. Obviously, they did not have the financial resource. The emotional resource was always one that was extremely critical, but difficult to, to really to have a strength with. They were very scared. They did not have making choices. They did not make choices wisely sometimes. It was a challenge for them. We needed to be able to provide that emotional support and help them with that. Medical issues we looked down through, but I think the biggest resource analysis pieces came from identifying their support systems and their relationships and role models, and the spiritual, which provided that future story. As we look at these 6 items, there are 5 items that are on the screen. I want to preface it by saying the resource analysis will help us focus on how we can support our families in this time. With the food insecurity or to provide food security, one of the things that we had in our district was free meals for all because of the high rate of free and reduced lunch in our district. But we need to make sure, if that's not the case in districts, that those meals are provided, breakfast, lunch, and even many places had a pack of hope or a food supply, sacks or backpacks of food that went home with the children on the weekends. One of the things that I found was many of our parents did not know the location of the food distribution centers, the food banks, the resource centers that provided food items in particular with fresh vegetables. What I then decided or found out the hard way was that they didn't know the locations. We could tell them where they were, but a map provided of those locations helped assure me that they at least had opportunity to see where those places were and the times that they were open, the days that they provided food. Many of them, though, require documents that they have, and families need to know upfront what documents they need going into those places. Because for many of my families, if they went once and they attempted to get food and they did not have the right documents, they never went back. And so one of our concerns was that the information provided was clear, articulated in such a way that they could understand what was needed and where it was. We also helped many of our families apply for SNAP benefits, especially our unaccompanied youth who had been on their own and they could get SNAP benefits in order to help provide or supplement their food in some way with whomever they were staying with at the time. It was a challenge to get families to reach out and take that assistance for many of them. They did not want to be on any list. Uh, I respect those families tremendously, but I also wanted to help them in any way that we could. Clothing and uniform needs. In McKinney-Vento, many districts around the country um, apply for funds from the federal government that's then distributed to the state governments and then to the schools or the districts in the sense of grants. That monies helps provide school clothing for our students. We were able to also buy shoes when we included it in our grant application. The things that are not provided, however, are undergarments, extracurricular clothing needs. They Many of our students with band or baseball or you name it, any of the other items in school, particularly at secondary when they needed additional clothing, it was a challenge many times. So instead of asking for help, asking for assistance, the child simply changed their schedule and dropped out. So we had to be very close to monitor kids who who were in programs in middle school who moved to the high school to make sure their coaches were aware, or their band directors or the choral directors or the drama coaches or whomever it was, that those items that they needed were provided, which is mandated by the law. We also provided information, an additional map of where the clothing closets were in our area, the days and times as well as when they were open, and what they provided in those locations. We worked very closely with many of those. We had vouchers that we could give many of our families so that they could take them and buy one set of clothing or something for the kids that they needed for school, or perhaps it was pajamas or undergarments or things that they may have had that were not provided by the Homeless Resource Office. Access to health care is a huge issue. Location of the clinics and times, information on prescription discounts, and the plan to repeat medications and doctor visits. Let's go back up to the location of clinics. Each clinic in our area had a different process, and so the families needed to know where the clinics were, what processes they used to intake patients, what days or times those occurred, and which would be easier for them to go to. We found that many places also had prescription discounts and prescription discount cards that they could take. That even though the doctor visits may have been covered, they still needed to go get prescriptions for their families. One of my challenges was helping families set up a schedule, because many times the medication was only month to month, and the doctors required patients to come in each month to be able to renew that prescription. As I heard back from principals many, many times, Johnny's out of his medication again. And I would check with mom or aunt or grandma or dad or whomever that child was living with. Say, okay, help me understand what, well, we forgot we didn't set up another appointment and we can't get in until next week. And so helping them regulate time and schedule time was also a large issue that we helped by teaching them how to plan when they before they left that appointment that day to set up the next one, and have them teach them how to put that reminder into their phone calendar so that that alert came up the day before, so that they could let the school know that child might be out at the end of that day or the beginning of the day in order to refill those medications. Housing needs. As I mentioned earlier, the area shelters were so crowded so many times, particularly our family abuse center. Many of our hotels had weekly or monthly discounts, and we had some that were, less than ideal, but families only had that opportunity to stay. So how do we help them provide a safer environment while they're there? The conversations around their housing needs, about the support, about safety and security while staying in that motel were huge. Support and counseling of living doubled up with a family. I found that so many of my children who were having emotional outbursts in class, who were getting suspended, who were in ISS, OSS, in any of the places that you go when you get in trouble, were children who were living doubled up with someone. And the tension when you have that many families living together in a home escalates. We know families right now in this current day and age are struggling with so many people inside their houses or staying at home. You can imagine if 2 or 3 families are there, what that the tension might be, the challenges, the arguments. I mean, it goes on and on. And so one of our goals was to provide additional counseling and support for families who were living doubled up on ways in which they could perhaps schedule some times within their family to be their family and not have to deal with everyone all the time. Housing needs is a huge challenge, and it changes time and time again for so many of our students. Most of my families who live doubled up changed that housing to another family at least once, if not twice, throughout the year. Academic support. This becomes an interesting component. I had brilliant students. In fact, we had some number 2 in the class, graduating class, was one of our homeless children. We couldn't publicize that. We can't, for privacy issues. We were not going to say that, but I was so very proud of her. She was such a dedicated, sweet child, and her mother was so supportive of her. But many of those special needs in sense of supplies were needed for her, materials were needed at higher level classes. And one of the things that we found working with families, if we don't build relationships with them, if we don't get to know them on a level that they feel comfortable talking with us, we're not going to know about those. Access to tutorials, homework assistance. Many of our children, if it was a choice, would choose not to stay because they did not have transportation home. And what we had to provide or wanted to make sure were available was that transportation to or from that tutorials or homework assistance after school. We also needed to help them with contacting the teachers and administrators many times. They had questions, but they did not know who to call. And many times they would call and simply speak to the school secretary, give them an earful of whatever was going on, but it didn't go any further than that. And many times the issues were not resolved. Many times parents would ask me to sit in on the child's teacher conferences with them. And as long as the parent would ask, then I could do that. It was perfectly all right with the schools as well, and from a legal standpoint as well, to be there to support those parents. Many times they just needed someone that they felt like was on their side to be there to support them. The challenge comes in many of our districts where they do not have a designated liaison, as I was in our district, because of the size of the campus. One of the things that I want to encourage districts to do who do not have that's their single job as a homeless liaison would be making sure that assistant superintendent or the director of student services or whomever it is has a strong line to the counselors on campus or the assistants on campus who help with the needs of those at-risk students. Most all campuses now have an at-risk person coordinator, someone who's completing that documentation on campuses, and they many times become a terrific contact for assistant superintendents or student services directors to meet with, talk with, or at least kick an email to let them know about the students who have been coded as homeless, to be able to provide that academic support and the other issues that they may run across with them. Contact is huge. That communication is huge. And many times when our parents could not get in touch with someone, they didn't call anyone. And if we wouldn't bring it up in conversations to find out what was going on, we weren't able to assist them. The good news was that many found that they could call and they could have support, and they were able to have that support provided for them as often as they needed. Emotional support is huge. Emotional support to me is the basis. And I think when Dr. Payne wrote the Emotional Poverty book, it put so many pieces in place for our department and working with our students and being able to help them see what those outbursts were about, but to provide that support needed and help them understand their workings of the brain and the whole blow up situation when the kids would get so upset, and help the parents understand what was going on with the children. But being able to provide that emotional support is key and maybe the most relevant piece of work that we did in working with our homeless families. Because without that support and identifying that support system, many of our accommodations, many of our recommendations and the supports that we provided would fall off because the support system was not there to keep it going. Some families had been impoverished for a long time. They had been homeless for a long time. Others, however, were navigating very unsure territory. They had a knowledge of the hidden rules from working class, and here they find themselves living basically in poverty with no real idea of the hidden rules that applied to living without so many of the resources. Helping them understand the difference in the resources and being able to identify key supports within each one of those helps secure our families and provide for them opportunity for opportunity for them to I'm sorry, my train of thought just left me for a moment, but it provided opportunity for them to remain consistent with those supports that we were working on. Empowering students to speak to authority is another piece that we found to be very important. I cannot tell you the number of phone calls that I had from administrators telling me I was about to get a phone call from an irate parent because the parent had called and the conversation had not gone well with the principal or assistant principal or counselor. Working with not only the high school students, middle school students, or in particular, and parents on how to speak to authority was huge. It did not take much, but helping them understand that speaking in an adult voice instead of a bossy voice, a demanding voice, but to come in with an adult voice that said, "This is what I need you to help me with." We literally gave parents some key phrases to use when going in to meet with the principal or assistant principal or the discipline officer or whomever it might be, so that they felt empowered to go in and have a conversation without there being an argument. We want them to speak freely. We wanted them to share the information. We want them to support their children, but we wanted them to do it in a way that it facilitated an opportunity for growth, not created a battleground. And so many times with our parents, that's what we found was happening when they would go to campuses. This emotional support piece is huge. And I think when we get that piece down and that piece together, then our families can be successful with what they're challenging, the new territory that they are traveling through. You know, as we look at families, this is probably the piece that we leave out. So many times, um, in so many schools that I've worked with, the children are coded and there's an identification that that child is homeless, but there's never much done with that information in the sense of empowering the family, working with the family in a way that helps them. As we look at families and we work with families, I would encourage everyone to be cognizant of the fact that many of our homeless children are overlooked when it comes to addressing many of those needs. That's why, again, I go back to that whole resource analysis. When you have a child that's in trouble a lot or missing homework a lot, to look at that to see which supports are there for that child and how are we meeting the needs with those resources that may be missing. What do our students need to be successful? They need all of the above. They need information about food and academics and social supports and clothing and safety. They need to know where the shelter is. They need to know where their access to health care can be. But I think most importantly, they need to know that we care. They need to know that we're there for them. As I think back about the families that I've had and the ones who've been successful, I think about a young woman who called our office. She was in tears. She had 3 elementary children, all under second grade when I first met her. And she called to tell me that she was living in her car. She'd been evicted from her apartment. She could not go live with her mom because her mom had some severe emotional issues and she could not be there for fear of what might happen with the children. This young woman was the head chef at one of our local restaurants, and she had been there for 5 years. She had insurance, but it only paid a portion of their health cost. Bright, bright young lady. She wanted to go to school, go back to college and get her degree, but she didn't have the funds to do so. Then she became pregnant, and she had a baby, and the baby died 2 weeks later at home with the three of them around. They knew that the baby would not last long, but the doctors had told her there was nothing they could do, and she did not have the funds to remain at the hospital, and so they went home with the baby. Over the course of that time, her job allowed her off work, but they did not pay her for being off, and so she got behind on her apartment and she was evicted. We got her into a home, an apartment that we have partnered with the Housing Authority, with Salvation Army, and they had a couple of apartments that I was able to help families move into, a transitional apartment to move into until we could get them into some permanent housing. While she was there, the children were attending school. The buses were picking them up each day and taking them to school. The second grader, who had some tremendous discipline issues that year because of everything happening in the family, the loss of the baby, the eviction that had occurred, he'd been in trouble a lot and was causing many, many challenges at school. We were able to get that back on track with work with the school, with the counselor, with meetings with them, being able to support them. We were able to get them the clothing that they need and help provide them with the shoes or coats or whatever from the clothing closets around town. One of the most important things was she began to go to school again. We helped her with a grant to be able to go back to the local community college, and she was going online to those classes. She carried a 4.0 for the 2 semesters that I had her in that apartment there and working with them. She has since completed that degree. So proud of her. She was able to then move into her own apartment with the help of the Waco Housing Authority and get into a place where she could afford, and with her work, and she had a new job and she was working well again. And she was able to turn that corner, and with the resources provided and with the support provided, that she was able to get her life back on track. One of the most important things she said to me, though, was she said, Kim, I've never had anybody sit down and help me plan. The planning piece of when do I buy the food? If I'm going to pay rent here, what does that look like? How do I stretch out my check to make it work? Over time, over the month, when the kids are always wanting to go here or go there or do this or do that. And I said, well, we have to make sure they understand that they're a part of this. And as you set up this budget, you help them know where the money's going. I get this amount of money. We spend this much on food. We spend this much on rent. We spend this much on gas, getting to and from places, on health care, and all of those items. Then let them know how much is available for the month, setting aside a portion of that for that entertainment component so that they can be empowered to see that they are helping with mom. They are working with mom to make life successful. She's on her own still today, and she's doing well. I'm very proud of her and what she's been doing. And there are more families and more stories that I could share with you. But it took a conscious effort from the school district to find families who wanted that assistance and help in learning how to plan, and learning how to manage their resources, and find out ways in which they could be successful living on what they were living on. We all know families who have little money who work well in society, and they're very successful in what they're doing in the sense of life, not so much in the sense of how much money they make. And we wanted our families to feel that empowerment, to be able to do what they needed to do to have that success in their lives. The Cove is a place I wanted to share with you because it was specifically given for homeless, unaccompanied youth. We needed a place for our unaccompanied youth to go after school, a place where they could be taken care of. Our unaccompanied youth who are couch surfing many times from place to place did not have a place to do their laundry. They did not have support for homework and what have you. The Cove was established now almost 4 years ago on the brainstorm of a couple of people who one of them was a homeless liaison at the time and a community person who came together to say, listen, we've got to do something with our unaccompanied children. They are a teen nurturing center, and it's only high school kids, and they come after school, and the whole goal was to empower them to be able to thrive as young adults with many of the same things that we just mentioned. We want to strengthen their ability to graduate from high school, and we want them to be able to go into college or the workforce, thereby preventing chronic homelessness from occurring. We provided homework help and laptops and Wi Fi and a study place for them. The school district worked with the Cove, although the Cove was not a Waco ISD entity, it was a support for the school district. We provided tutors and mentors with our grant to be able to go there and tutor our kids. They were able to then get online for credit recovery or to make up time on absences like they would have done on Saturday school as well, all with the blessing and support of the school district. Each evening, family style meals were served and healthy snacks were available when they came off the bus because they were always hungry when they stepped off the bus. We had a washer and dryer, laundry facilities for them because many times their entire wardrobe was in their backpack or an additional backpack that they left at someone's home they could go back to, but they would switch out the clothes each day to come to bring to the Cove to be able to wash it there so that they did not have to ask to use the washer or dryer of whomever they were couch surfing or to go to the laundromat. We had showers and toiletries available for them and socks and all kinds of items for them. Uh, our store, but basically it was a store without having to pay. What they had to do to get to the store was to come and participate in the activities that were there. Counseling was available. We had a doctor that came once a week. Haircutting services. We had a beauty shop across, actually right next to us, and one across the street that were more than willing to help our kids who needed those haircuts. And even for prom at times, helping the young ladies with their hairstyles. Case management was provided for all students. We wanted them to be able to share, and each child that came in was an intake process to find out again what resources they had available to them, what needs they had, what different childhood experiences that they had had that might be having an impact on where they were in high school. Positive youth development programming. Each evening there was a speaker many times that would come and talk with them, share with them, be it budgeting, be it counseling, be it how to fill out an application, you name it. We had all different kinds of speakers who came in to support the children. And again, we had SNAP and Medicaid outreach where we were able to provide connections for them for the documentation for that to occur so that they could have that support as well. The pictures that you see on the screen are just a few of the locations within the gathering center that you see there on the far right, where they would come in. You can see the dining table where they met for their evening meal, or laundry facilities. We had an art room where the kids could just express themselves and go in and create things or draw things, or just we even had an art counselor come for a time to help them share or share with them ways in which they could use art to express their emotions. We had reading rooms with books, many, many books, all kinds of books for them to be able to plop on the couch or in the floor on the bean bags or what have you, to be able to read and to have that supportive home environment. They were there from about 4 to 8 in the evening when they were taken home. Home being relevant to not a home as we would think, but where they were sleeping that evening. We did not only support our unaccompanied youth, we had some um, children who were homeless in the sense of living doubled up, living in some dire circumstances at the motels and different places, who also came to the Cove for support and assistance needed. When we arrived in Waco, when we left there and we moved to Oklahoma, one of the blessings that I found is Gabriel's house was located in our own town here. And it was also a nurturing center, ways in which the community had come together with the school district to provide opportunities for the younger children. And the bus also delivers these students to Gabriel's house after school each day. There's healthy snacks were provided and their homework help, and a nutritional dinner was also provided. They take field trips, they do service projects, there's outdoor playtime and a playground there for them. They have a character curriculum that they help empower the students to think about faith and hope and kindness and generosity and so many things that are needed in a child's life. Enrichment opportunities were also provided for them. All over our country, and I know in many parts of the world as well, there are people, organizations, there are districts who are reaching out to help our homeless families. If you do not have one of those, a location, a place of support for children, it would be a consideration to take up with your community workers, your community governments to see, is there a way in which we can support our homeless children? One of the things that I realized in all this work, and I've worked in the school districts in so many ways, it's been 17 years as a teacher in the classroom, which I loved every minute of. I've been an intern working with an interventionist. I have been an assistant principal. I've been a principal. I've been assistant superintendent, just a number of hats worn. And I think as I look back at my work in the schools, to me, the one that has touched my heart the most has been the working with the homeless community. One of the things that I do know is that our families deserve an opportunity to be successful, but they need to have the resources available to them. They need the training to understand what those are. They need a partnership. They need a community around them, and they need to be able to feel empowered to do what they need to do. What do our students need to be successful? All of the above. And we try every day to help our kids do just that. Dr. Rita Pearson, I will always remember, as near and dear to my heart, has always said, every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understands the power of connection and insists that they become the best they can possibly be.